Good afternoon to our viewers in the United States and good evening to those in Europe. A warm welcome to this discussion organized by the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. My name is Jörn Fleck. I'm the Deputy Director of the Europe Center, and I'll be moderating today's discussion under our Germany Votes, the Superwahljahr series. We started the series this summer as the Europe Center's programming around the German elections in September, and at a critical moment in Germany's modern history, with the departure of Angela Merkel after 16 years in the chancellery, and at the helm of 4 German governments. Throughout the fall, the Europe Center hosted events, published analysis, and chatted with our friends and experts in our virtual debrief series to track the elections, analyze the outcome, and take a look at the future of Germany's role in the world. This event today serves as our wrap-up of this Germany Votes series, with a conversation on the new German government under Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the government's priorities, and what the change in Berlin might mean for Germany and the country's role in Europe and the world. And we're closing out in the same fashion as we kicked off this series in September in many ways. Joining us again are Tyson Barker, Head of the Technology and Global Affairs Program at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and Constanze Stelzenmüller, Senior Fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe, and the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at the Brookings Institution. And we have a new addition, our very own Rachel Rizzo, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Tyson, Constanze, you set the bar high with an engaging and fun, but also substantive discussion in September when we kicked off, a rare combination, and I'm sure with Rachel's help, we can even exceed that bar this time. For our audience, please follow along and ask questions by either using the Q&A function, Q&A feature in Zoom, or by tweeting at us using the hashtag #GermanyVotes, and we will try to include some of your questions as we go along. But let's get started. As everyone will be aware, there's a new German government under Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Were sworn in last Wednesday, December 9. It's a first for modern Germany in that Scholz will lead is leading a 3-way coalition between the center-left Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the pro-business Free Democrats or Liberals. Those 3 agreed a coalition tree that sets out the new government's broad priorities and objectives, and we'll talk about that in some more detail. And they did so in negotiations that were smoother and more disciplined perhaps than many of us had expected. And in the first few days, we saw the usual flurry of international visits to Paris, Brussels, and Warsaw. And we had the first spat, the first minor conflict between coalition partners on foreign policy nonetheless. So lots of gossip there that we can come to. But before we get into more details on the foreign policy dimension and what Germany's partners abroad can expect from Berlin and this new government, let me turn to Tyson perhaps first, who can help us set the scene a little bit here and give our audience the quick background on this new government, the key priorities as you see them, and the outlook moving forward.
Well, thanks so much, Jörn, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for this invitation. It's really fun to bookend this conversation, and we've had a lot of fun chats over the past 4 months or so. I thought at the top I might make 3 points that have interested me seeing this embryonic coalition take shape. And of course, everything that we say to some extent is informed, but somewhat speculative, because of course, events are going to be the things that shape and test the mettle of this coalition. But there are 3 areas that I find quite interesting, and I'd like to highlight just at the outset. First is Scholz as a manager. I think we underestimate not just how Merkel was as a leader, but also how Merkel was as a manager. And the departure of what I would call the Merkel operating system, or Merkel OS, after 6 years, 4 updates, 16 years, excuse me, in office, is going to mean a lot of changes, both in the way that foreign and domestic policy is handled. So a lot of the kind of characteristics that we associate with Merkel, both her iterative iterative style of leadership, her step-by-step working both internationally and domestically, occasionally rocked by external events like Fukushima or like the 2015 migration wave, where she had these big U-turns in her politics. And then she kind of reoriented the entire country, basically by force of her own will and use of her own political capital. That is not necessarily the way that Scholz is going to govern. And, we can see already in Scholz that he is very soft-spoken, that he has a certain sang-froid. The way that he campaigned was never, it was not like Gerhard Schröder, a kind of charismatic style that roused his followers. It was much more assurance-based. It was much more consistency-based. But if you look at his kind of priorities, I think we can see, that he might be drawing on some of those Hanseatic traditions that we see with the likes of Helmut Schmidt, also a former political leader in Hamburg. He had different roles, but also a former finance minister. And also, and this is where we go into kind of the policies, also somebody who emphasized a lot, and I know we think about him in the context of the Cold War and also a little bit European integration, but also a lot on domestic social and political cohesion. And if you look at the things that really seem to excite, well, I don't know if excite is the right word, but the first points that Scholz tends to emphasize, they tend to be around social cohesion and lifting up and bringing the German population closer together. So the two things that I always hear him mention concretely is one, raising the minimum wage to 12 euros. And second, building about 400,000 new apartments in Germany to help the housing crunch that is present in the country. And both of these kind of have echoes of a Helmut Schmidt style politics. And the second area that I would say is a really important one for this coalition, and this draws not on the Social Democrats, who I think their number one issue is social cohesion, but on the other two partner parties in this is the dual transformation in Germany. So the digital transformation of Germany and the, let's say, ecological or climate transformation of Germany. And those, of course, draw on the strengths of these two other junior coalition partners, both of which are trying to establish an identity as being the primary agent shaping these policies. But if you look at the campaign, for example, I think we talked about it when we spoke in September. The Mosel floods really drew into high relief, and Jorn, I know you have family in the region. The Mosel floods really drew into high relief, the impact of climate change on people's everyday lives. And that is something that I think that the Greens are really going to seize on, and you're going to see throughout their ministerial portfolios across the board, from foreign policy to economic policy, et cetera. And then, of course, digitization, which is the area I focus on, I would love to speak to in greater detail later in this talk. And the third thing I would say is just, if you look at the coalition agreement, the 177-page document, there is, in the German way, a kind of new energy there. It's an iterative energy, but it's new. So whereas in the past, in the Grand Coalition, you could expect a lot of emphasis on something like, say, multilateralism, here we have a lot more emphasis on democracy. You have a lot of exact, direct points that the coalition makes on China's abuses in Xinjiang, in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, with forced labor, on human rights, on defense. There's a lot more boldness in this document than I think what we would have expected from previous coalition negotiations. And that's interesting to see. I think we do sometimes make a little bit too much of what coalition negotiations or coalition agreements really mean. These are not sacred texts. A lot of times coalitions actually do depart from them quite significantly, but at least in those broad strokes, I think that there's a lot to be interested in and to discuss today.
Thank you, Tyson. That tees us up very nicely. We'll definitely come back to a lot of those issues that you mentioned, including technology. But I wanted to turn to Constanze, and I know you've come back from Germany recently, and get your take on the outlook for this government and the style and substance. Do you detect the same about a new energy and boldness in the coalition, Constanze, or how would you view this?
Thank you, first off, for having me on, and I apologize for being a bit late. We had a trustee call that went just a tad over, and so I had to go do this back to back. Also, in case you're wondering about my hair, Berlin hairdressers have a different understanding of the word discreet. But there you go.
Looking good, Constanze.
Thank you. Somebody mentioned the word max headroom in an event last week. That cultural reference dates one. But for those of you on here who don't know it, look it up. Anywho, I was in Berlin for a week in early December, and then spent another week traveling throughout Germany and seeing people. And yes, there is a sense, of course, that the old government had exhausted itself, that the Christian Democrats, Merkel's party, had exhausted itself, that they're now engaged in an indecorous circular firing squad, trying to determine new leadership. All that's true. I will say, though, that Scholz was Merkel's finance minister for 4 years. Scholz's party, the SPD, were in a coalition with her for 3 out of her 4 terms, and the Liberals were in a coalition for the other term. So yeah, there is an element of continuity. I mean, come on, this is Germany after all. But Tyson is right in saying that there is sort of a real will to change in the air. And everything that Tyson said about the transformational plans of this government is correct. And I will say, A, it feels right, and B, it feels somewhat historical. I can't recall a German government having come in with plans this ambitious and at the head of an unprecedented 3-way coalition in a time of unprecedented external challenges and with some very real financial constraints, right? So you know, to want this kind of transformation, if you had historic budget surpluses like we had 4 years ago, would be one thing. But to want them now, when the Russians are threatening Ukraine with invasion, and when your budget surpluses have been depleted by a pandemic, is something else. I mean, I applaud the ambition. I am slightly concerned about the feasibility, but we'll see. We'll see. I do see the option of it. I mean, I am, maybe I'm by nature hopeful. I do hope they get part of it done, because I think it is absolutely necessary and beyond time. The other thing that I think is good about this is the very overt shift to the systemic competition narrative as far as Germany's role in the world is concerned. With obviously differences in nuance between Chancellor Scholz and Foreign Minister Baerbock that are important, and a big question mark where the defense ministry is. But again, it's early days I think it's too early for any of us to want to sort of parse that out in detail. The thing that sort of fascinates me as well is that this is also a government that represents a generational shift in ways that I haven't really seen, and maybe Rachel will want to speak to this, but this is, the biggest, youngest, most diverse legislature that we've seen. And that's also true for the government, which is now firmly representing the post-fall of the wall generation, with a foreign minister in Annalena Baerbock who's 40 and as old as her own party, right? That's a really big deal in attitudinal changes. And I think we'll see that play out. The other thing that sort of fascinates me as a person of the female persuasion is that the security ministries are all headed by women, right? Interior, foreign, and defense. Never been done in Germany. This is the first time they've been run by women. And I will be very interested to see how that goes. There are risks, I think, financing this transformation, the tensions between the coalition partners, which are very real. The tensions within the parties, the SPD and the Greens have strong left wings. And then there is the hard right, which, didn't make it into the Bundestag at the level that it did in 2017, but did bring in some really egregious sort of hard right, forgive me if I say this, nutcases, and which came in first in 2 of the East German Länder, and which has been sort of showing its power on German and on East German streets on recent nights in very unpleasant and dangerous ways, and who are thought to be, increasingly looking like a sort of German equivalent of the Proud Boys of the 3%. I take this very seriously. And I mean, do I see a lot of opportunities there? Yes, I do. I think that there is a lot that could be done under these circumstances, but I suspect that like many governments that come in with a great deal of hope and plans, this government will be ground down by reality. And it will, if we're all unlucky, then it will be mugged by a Russian offensive in Ukraine. Even if that doesn't happen, because the Kremlin decides at the 11th hour that it has some shred of rationality remaining, there is still a real risk of the Kremlin here using military means for political ends and achieving the humiliation, the destabilization, and maybe the replacement of the government in Kyiv, and also a division, sowing divisions and discord within the alliance. All that's possible, and I'm obviously wishing for that not to happen, but we'll have to see how that plays out. I'm going to shut up now and let Rachel talk.
Thank you, Constance. Lots of stuff, lots of issues and perspectives you and Tyson put on the table there. Maybe we shift before we pull at individual points there a little bit. Let me turn to Rachel and just ask Rachel and start with the perspective from Washington, D.C. And what do you think, Rachel, the U.S. administration, the Biden administration can expect from this new government? Since the Biden administration's assumed office, high expectations or demands for a tougher line from Berlin on several issues, not least Russia, relations with Russia, and also with Beijing. But what do you think the Biden administration can realistically expect? Where will we see areas of opportunity for U.S. foreign policy and engagement with Berlin, and where will we see either continuity in the sense of a bad continuity from more alignment between Washington, D.C. and Berlin, or new opportunities?
Sure. So I think Constanza and Tyson both brought up some really interesting points. I mean, the first, Tyson's right that a lot of what we say here is speculative, because the reality will more than likely shift what was, for example, written in the coalition agreement, right? So you can have goals and plans, but reality is going to make those look perhaps very different than they were originally seen. The second, Schultz did not run on a transformative platform. I mean, I think Constanza said it right, that we are going to see a lot of continuity in this government, perhaps with, additional pressure from the Greens and the foreign ministry. But I think with the Biden administration, their goal of repairing the U.S.-German relationship that was so badly damaged during the 4 years of the Trump presidency, I think the stage is set for that to be repaired. But I also think that there are some ongoing issues, mainly Nord Stream 2, which are always gonna create friction between the two sides. But I think there are a few things, and my friend Max Bergman and I over at the Center for American Progress, he and I just wrote something last week on perhaps what we can expect from this new government. The first, I think, at least from the Greens in charge of the foreign ministry, they'll try to, I think, drive a more values-based approach to foreign policy, which could perhaps translate into taking a tougher line with autocrats. Historically, the Greens have been more hawkish when it comes to Russia and China. But at the same time, the foreign policy decision-making during the 16 years of Merkel's chancellorship was sort of brought under that of the Chancellery. So how much power the Greens actually have, I think, is yet to be seen. But, looking back at Biden's speech to a joint session of Congress earlier this year, he really does couch the current geopolitical context in this broader struggle between democracies and authoritarians. And so I think they are going to try to push, this administration is going to try to push Germany to take a tougher line on some of those issues, which I think, will perhaps be seeing tougher lines anyways with the Greens in the foreign ministry. I also thought it was interesting that the coalition agreement said that this coalition, this government, is going to put Europe first. It said they want to raise Europe's strategic sovereignty, saying that the sovereignty of Europe is a cornerstone of their foreign policy. How that actually ends up translating into real world policies, I think is yet to be seen, but at least the messaging is there. And I think that's a good start, especially because from this administration in the United States, there's a support that we're seeing in Washington for really the first time on this concept of strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty. And so I think that could marry up well with the goals of the Biden administration and the stated goals from the Scholz government. I think it was notable that the coalition agreement talked a lot about climate and is setting, Germany to be a global leader on this issue. I think, Merkel sort of leaves with this a mixed domestic record. But I think that the issue of climate will see a massive investment, but there's always going to be, I think, this sort of tension between the Greens, who are, obviously historically much more climate focused, and the fiscally conservative Free Democrats that are going to be in charge of the finance ministry. So I think how that ends up playing out is going to be really interesting to watch. I think Washington might be a little bit disappointed when it comes to Germany playing a larger, more powerful role in terms of defense or their role in NATO. I thought it was notable that the coalition didn't explicitly say that their goal was to spend 2% of GDP on defense in line with NATO targets, but instead mentioned vaguely spending 3% on a much more broadly defined set of priorities in addition to defense, which includes diplomacy and development. And I think that's and sort of an easy out, because it doesn't really say how much is actually going to be spent where. So I think I can stop there, but suffice it to say, I think the stage is set for a continuation of this stronger relationship between the United States and Germany, but how it ends up playing out given ongoing international security issues, namely, Nord Stream 2 in Russia, I think is yet to be seen.
Thank you, Rachel. I know we have an on-camera question from Adrian Hofer at the Eurasia Center at the Council that I think fits in well here. On Nord Stream 2, you ended on that. Let me turn over to Adrian to continue with that.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. So we've already seen what could be a new resolve within the German government when it comes to Russia. On Sunday, we saw the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock telling ZDF on the sidelines of G7 that should Russia escalate further in Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 will not be allowed to operate within Europe. Do you think that this will be the basis of a new foreign policy that sees Germany's government align itself more with the views of its European neighbors and the United States on Russia? Or especially with the Greens helming the foreign ministry, is that more the view of the Greens and the SPD and the FDP taking a separate view from the Greens?
Thank you, Adrian. Maybe I'll turn to Constanze and then make the rounds.
Sure. So look, I think if you talk to German diplomats privately, they will say this is the biggest albatross hanging around our necks. Okay. You won't find a lot of passionate defenders of Nord Stream 2 within the German system anymore. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think you have to, Annalena Baerbock hasn't been the only one putting this on the table. Scholz has hinted at it. And in the week before she left office, Merkel stood in Berlin next to Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki and said, directed at the Kremlin, there will be severest economic consequences if Russia should undertake an incursion into Ukraine. She didn't spell it out, but I think everybody thought, everybody knew what that could mean, right? The other thing to understand here is that the federal certifying agency for gas infrastructure, among other things, the Bundesnetzagentur, has about 3 weeks ago denied certification, which is the last regulatory step for the pipeline to come into operation. And as you will have seen, the Germans have been demarching people here in Washington with a non-paper that was promptly put on Twitter that said that this step bought about 9 months of time, potentially until September, right? What it also buys, in my view, is a sort of depoliticized, sort of technical framing for the question of whether to turn it off or on. But one that, if the Russians make good on the threats that they're currently issuing, I think would give the German government an excuse to refuse certification on national security grounds in ways that would be the legal equivalent of asserting eminent domain, but would, because of those exceptional national security grounds, exempt them from damages claims by the companies involved. That's a real thing because it happened in 2011 after Merkel took Germany out of nuclear power. And all the companies involved sued the German government to the tune of billions. That's a for a government that's coming into power with this kind of transformational agenda on the basis of, shall we say, less generous, lavishly generous surpluses than we had 4 years ago, is a real thing. So that's something to keep in mind. That said, again, if there is a remnant of rationality left in the Kremlin doesn't do this, but hopes instead that it can use military threats towards political purposes, to humiliate the Ukrainians and to humiliate the alliance. My guess is that that's the most rational analysis of what's going on here. It still bears a very real risk of catastrophic accidental escalation or misjudgment of each other's goals.
Thank you, Constanze. Over to Tyson, who I know was eager to respond.
Well, Constanze said a lot. I mean, I would just, the thing I hear more than anything is the sort of Damocles of damages claims to the tune of billions of euros from companies if there was a moratorium or if this project was completely scrapped. So any kind of a loophole or exemption to that process might make it more likely. But I mean, clearly that is not the conditions that would enable that Nord Stream 2 to stop are not conditions that we want to see happen, i.e. an invasion of Ukraine. But I would say this, beyond the acute crisis that Ukraine is facing right now on its border to the east, there is a kind of new strategic dynamic that's developing. And I think we can't just focus on the foreign ministry, but we should really focus on the consistencies, the policy consistencies, and latch up between the foreign and economic ministry. Because the economic ministry actually has a lot of control over energy and obviously climate change and sanctions and dual use export controls and FDI screening and all these things that are going to be very important as this new government pursues strategic sovereignty, which Annalena Baerbock defined not as military sovereignty, but as economic and technological sovereignty. So that kind of, let's say, ministerial tandem, and the way that those two ministers work together is going to be quite key. And if they are able to work together consistently and forge an alliance, because of course they're from the same parties, they've been working together for years, Baerbock and Habeck, then I think we could see a clearer identity in a lot of these kind of geoeconomic questions in the future.
Rachel, anything you want to add on that, or maybe connect this with you already mentioned European strategic sovereignty, as they call it, a merger of many terms in the debate, and maybe also what people saw in the defense in defense policy sections of the coalition treaty. I know it's aspirational. Their declarations of intent and politics and policy might work out differently, but maybe update us on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start by saying I think what's going to be interesting, and I think Tyson and Constanza have really done a bang up job of hitting the Nord Stream 2 issue in depth. It's going to be interesting to see how the Republicans in Congress continue this ongoing pressure campaign that they've been instituting over the last 4 or 5 or 6 months. You know, there's still ambassadorial nominees to Europe that aren't getting votes because of this pressure over Nord Stream and the desire of the Republicans for sanctions to ensure that the pipeline gets stopped. So I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen with that, but I think that there's the potential for this to be really, really dragged out for a long time. And, you know, we're seeing Democrats in Congress starting to really put pressure on the Republicans. So how that plays out will be interesting to watch. You know, I think, Tyson, I think you said something about Scholz's managerial style in your opening remarks. And I thought it was interesting that he sort of Scholz made the same remarks on the new, regarding the new defense minister, and kind of talking about her managerial skills. And so I thought that was sort of an interesting parallel there. I mean, again, like I think, you know, looking at the new defense minister, you know, reforming the Bundeswehr's acquisition process, which is always this like perennial objective for new office holders, you know, looking at the rationale behind Germany's overseas deployments and looking, you know, always having a need for an exit strategy. I think what's interesting, another interesting thing to watch is that, you know, Germany did decide to stay in NATO's nuclear sharing agreement, which I think takes a lot of the pressure off of the United States, because that's something that we were a little worried about. But what happens if the coalition government fails to line up a replacement aircraft? I think that's something that we're going to be closely watching. But I think probably the most salient thing I've heard, it was a response that I think it was Jana from the European Council on Foreign Relations. So sort of she mentioned in response to the article that Max and I wrote, and it's how this issue of strategic sovereignty will translate into the defense space. Because when we talk about it here in Washington, D.C., it really is discussed through this lens of military capabilities. And when you talk about it in Germany, I don't know that it has that same sort of connotation. And if it does, people like Baerbock are trying to shift that away from military capabilities into the economic realm. I thought it was interesting over the last few years, like you saw hints of what a more capable and autonomous Europe might look like. I mean, look at former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo going to the UN and talking about instituting snapback sanctions on Iran. And you got a lot of pushback from European countries, especially Germany, on that. You also had European countries try to create this special purpose vehicle to sidestep US sanctions. So you sort of see what strategic sovereignty might look like when you take a more economic approach to it. But I think, again, how that plays out, we can only speculate thus far. But I think there's a desire and a hope from this administration here in Washington. There's a support here for those actions, for a more equal partnership that there hasn't been in the past. And so Germany, I think, would be wise to take advantage of that window of opportunity.
Thank you, Rachel. All of you have already hinted at this tension in the coalition and even within the coalition parties, as Constanze pointed out. There's that Schröder from the times of the first SPD Greens coalition saying about the cook, the chef, and the waiter, junior and senior partners. In the chat, we also have a few questions around this sort of. Where do you see the flashpoints, the main points of conflict between the coalition partners? And how do you think Scholz's approach, as you said, a managerial one, will help either resolve that, or, inaction, as we've seen in previous years, might also cause more problems than any good? So how do you see those tensions? Where do you see those main areas of tension? And how do you think Scholz will have to deal with that? Maybe to Tyson.
I mean, the first one, and this is obvious, is around fiscal policy, and I would say even European policy, because the FDP is going to want to kind of revive the image of Wolfgang Schäuble, the black zero, the balanced budget, as a way to harden their credibility with their base. I mean, that is seen as kind of a almost talismanic in particularly for Christian Lindner, who has really consolidated power in that party. The interesting thing is, I think that although people tend to point to the tensions lying with the Greens on this, because of course, to go through a major climate transformation of the economy, it's going to require a lot of public spending, which will, of course, mean borrowing. And as Constanze mentioned, Germany's not in the same fiscal position that it was prior to the crisis. I think it could also play out on the European level. And I think that's why you've seen Lindner kind of say, well, we can maybe look at relaxing rules around the way we manage, debt across the Eurozone. Maybe we can consider things around industrial policy, around European spending, because I think he knows that this is a priority for Scholz. Scholz, of course, was a finance minister for many years. One of the things that he's quite proud of on the global stage was basically shepherding the global minimum tax rate at the OECD, which, of course, got the support of the Biden administration, which was key. And I think that's the first kind of proto-Scholz as chancellor moment on the global stage. But he was also key, and it's kind of his big moment, his big coming out moment in German politics in this phase in his career of the Big Bang during the COVID, essentially the COVID rescue package, and the way that opened up space as well for the European Recovery and Resilience Facility, this first time that Europe basically Euroized, recovery across the European Union, which was seen as a one-off. But I think that the instinct in Chancellery is to really push for greater an ever closer union, as it states in the European treaties. So I think that could be an area of tension. I'll leave it at that right now.
Constanze, maybe over to you.
Well, all of that's right. I think it's a German tradition for the Chancellor to and the foreign minister to be in a clinch with each other over the details of foreign and security policy, right? And some defense ministers want to have their own foreign and security policy. Some of them see themselves as armed forces ministers, right? Some social democrat ministers have indeed gone that route. It's really too early to say, but I do get the impression that Scholz thinks of himself as a dyed-in-the-wool transatlanticist, a dyed-in-the-wool Europeanist. I think his role and that of his new chief of staff, Wolfgang Schmidt, in designing the Big Bang, the European Recovery Program, is really important because it speaks to a commitment to a more generous German stance towards European policy. But the test is indeed going to be both sort of internal divisions over rule of law and external challenges like Russia and China. Yeah, that's where we will find out how this works. And very often, in my experience, coalition agreements, are intended as a kind of, they help people, the negotiating partners, find out where each of them stands, right? And to plot out areas of disagreement, which are then treated with ambiguity. As Rachel noted, the the 3% commitment is such a deliberate ambiguity. And honestly, on these internal and external tests depends whether this, unique historical three-way coalition will be a transitional arrangement or something that provides a firm basis for future policy. Honestly, it's, give us a break, give them a break. They've been in power for a week. We're not prophets, and we can't, respectably assert to know how this is going to go. But I think that there are going to be, I am willing to bet that there are going to be potentially some quite significant divisions over defense policy and NATO commitments. But if the Russians, as they are wont to do, overplay their hand, then the Russians will help us answer that question. And then the left wing of the Social Democrats and of the Greens will find it hard to find sort of real life arguments. And, having seen this movie a couple of times and covered in particular the Kosovo Air War in 1998 and 99, I have little confidence in the Kremlin's ability to finely tune its behavior towards Europe.
Okay, Moscow will help us find out.
Kremlin.
The Kremlin. Sorry, yes. Rachel, I want to turn to you for a question from the chat. Moving on, maybe to defense matters a little bit. We know that there'll be 2 lines of inquiry into the Afghanistan withdrawal. One sort of specifically focused on the German government response, and one on the more sort of what can we lessons learned from these operations. And Katrin Bastian is asking, how do you assess Germany's future appetite for collective foreign military interventions post-Afghanistan?
That's a good question. I think also a good question would be, how do you assess anyone's future appetite for collective foreign military interventions after Afghanistan? It's so interesting because, living in Washington and talking to people here and watching the Afghanistan withdrawal and watching the messaging that was coming out of the administration and kind of talking about how European allies were consulted and this was a joint effort. And then you talk to Europeans and basically what it came down to was the United States said that they're leaving and we have no other choice. That's if we sort of want to put it crudely, that was, I think there was no other way that the Europeans were going to stay in Afghanistan without the United States. And so I think it brings to bear a broader question of European capacity in general. And when we talk about issues of capacity building, what does that entail in a world? If you could picture a world where the idea of strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy is a reality, would that have meant that the Europeans would have had the ability to stay in Afghanistan even as the United States was leaving? And would that have been a discussion that could have been had? As things stand now, no. I think in general, the collective appetite for foreign military interventions in general, I think is extremely low, because it's not just Afghanistan that we're talking about. We're talking about post-Iraq. We're talking about Libya. This needs to be looked at, I think, in a much broader sort of holistic way. And so I don't think there would be many people who would, push for a bigger appetite in terms of that specific topic. And nor do I think people should. Going back to something that I think both Tyson and Constanza have said, looking at people always talk about this like friction between the different coalition partners, but Constanza, I think you made a good point, which is that we have a new generation of foreign policy makers and decision makers that are going to be in very powerful positions in this government. And so what I will be looking at more closely is how those emerging issues that are more salient with the next generation of foreign policy thinkers might clash with that of the old guard. It's not just Germany where we have that problem. It's in the United States too. These are conversations that we're having across the board. And so, again, it's too early to say, and anything that we did say would be purely speculative, but I do think that's something that's interesting to watch and that we'll be watching closely.
Can I?
Yeah, jump in, Constanza.
I tend to think that the question of the West's appetite for intervention is a little bit academic, right? Because the question may be forced on us, and in ways that are unlike the sort of academic framing of this issue. And here it helps to study, or to have, like me, and had the misfortune of having lived through the Yugoslav wars. What the Russians, I think, are trying to do here is drag the West and us Germans on ground on which we are not comfortable and where our publics, will tell us to stay away, right? And thereby to humiliate us and to prove that we're, demoralized by Afghanistan, and that this means the alliance is sort of defunct. And my experience has been that if there is real bloodshed, there is also public outrage. I think of the 4 Eastern European neighborhood countries, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, right now in European public perception, and that includes German public perception, 3 of the 4 are considered as having sort of proved that they really are on a westward course. Belarusian opposition leader, but also the Belarusian civil society have gotten a huge amount of traction. Tsikhanouskaya has been everywhere meeting with people. Coverage has been intense. Similar things have been true of Ukraine. There is always criticism of Ukrainian oligarchs and, sort of private militias and that kind of stuff. But I think that people's sense that Ukraine really is a separate country with agency and with a will to ally itself with the West, I think is accepted at this point. And the same thing is true for Moldova. The Georgians, I think, are a case unto themselves because of a very zigzaggy course they've pursued. And if there is, God forbid, bloodshed, there will be a public outcry. And then there will be, yet again, a debate about humanitarian aid and securing humanitarian aid, and about flight interdiction zones, and about weapons deliveries, and about perhaps war crimes tribunals. None of that falls under the heading of, would we intervene as NATO? Because yes, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so Article 5 doesn't apply. But there are many, many other ways in which we could slowly be dragged into a very complex situation, which would be no longer peace, but not quite war, with a great power that has nuclear weapons, and for which we don't really have a framing at NATO, except for that past experience with the Yugoslav wars, where the Serbs were a Russian proxy, right? And that is a terrain which would be extremely difficult for Western governments and publics to navigate, and where I think the Kremlin might be assessing that because they are less worried about their public and more ruthless, they would have a stronger hand to play than we do. And that's entirely possible. But I would also say that the Russians have a record of overplaying their hand, playing a strong card badly and then losing. We've seen that happen a couple of times in recent decades. And we have seen that kind of situation unifying European and transatlantic publics and policymakers, and rallying to defend embattled civil societies. So I think my advice to the Kremlin, if anybody from the Russian embassy is listening, is to maybe say, play it carefully here. Because this can go very much not your way.
Thank you, Constanze. I know we can just on Russia, we could spend a lot more time and have an event in and of itself, German, Russian, transatlantic. I do want to touch on two more points before we wrap up. One is the technology side of things, Tyson, and Rachel kind of alluded to this, the new agenda. You refer to the dual transformation in your opening, Tyson, climate and digital or technology. What impact do you see from this government on that agenda at the EU level?
Again, it's too soon to tell. The one thing I will say, and
let's speculate. Yeah,
I'm going to speculate. Of course, I will. You know, that's what we do best. I mean, so I have to say this is where I was a little disappointed in the coalition, because if you look at the so for normal nerds, they read the coalition agreement, but for the real nerds, you read the organizational decree, which is essentially the first executive order that the new chancellor gives out, reorganizing the government. And in this government reorg, you could see the tussle that took place on where the digital files would lay. So everything from data and artificial intelligence to industrial policy around semiconductors to the entire European digital agenda to the international stuff, all of it. And it was just a smorgasbord. So there is a new Ministry of Digital Affairs and Transport. It is headed by a member of the Liberal Party, but they do not have all the instruments at their disposal to manage tech policy. There's still many important instruments in the Economic Ministry, in the Finance Ministry, and we should mention in the Justice and Interior Ministry. The Interior Ministry is responsible for the IT consolidation in Germany, which is a political viper's nest. And I wish the new minister good luck with updating at all levels of German government away from faxes, liberating the country from fax machines. You know, Germany has been working to kind of develop a strategic vision of technology along with France and primarily the Commission for the past couple of years, primarily because of the new awareness of their dependencies, also the geopoliticization of dual use and general purpose technologies. And I don't think that that's going to stop, to be quite honest. I think that is going to continue. I think we can expect big moves on chips, or semiconductors. I think we can expect big moves on quantum computing, on cybersecurity. There's a lot of effort to bolster things. There is lines in the coalition negotiation about an active digital foreign policy, which outlines, I would say, 5 lines of action. The most interesting of which is related to ICT infrastructure in the global South and strengthening sovereignty in the global South. And I think this is important to say. When the Germans say sovereignty, they don't mean it like we do typically mean it in English. This is not a Westphalian conception of sovereignty necessarily. It can be, but it really has to do with freedom to choose. And that freedom to choose can happen at the state level, it can happen at the company level, or it can happen at the individual level. And so a lot of times when they talk about sovereignty, it's actually a reference to breaking lock-in effects, making sure that there aren't asymmetric dependencies, all the things that are kind of encapsulated in the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And I think that on the tech side, the first test of that mettle will be in the German G7 presidency, which starts on January 1st, 2022. So not only is Germany being confronted by events that, can go in any which way, as we're seeing with the Ukraine-Russia tensions, but we also know that Germany is going to be taking the world stage with an agenda in the G7 next year. And they have outlined the previous government, and I think it's going to be consistent through this next government, 3 areas to focus on: climate, COVID, and infrastructure. And that infrastructure piece is going to be where we're going to see that tech foreign policy agenda start to take shape. So watch this space. I know we got 4 minutes.
Thank you, Tyson. So I take away liberating Germany from fax machines as a major priority of the new government.
No. We will not relinquish our fax machines. This must not happen.
Another area of conflict for the coalition. I hope not.
It's already
Oh,
conflict.
my dead body.
Okay. Strong feelings on the tech issues as always. So with only a few minutes left, I wanted to do a quick lightning round with everyone. We've seen the visits to Paris, Brussels, and Warsaw. There's lots we should have covered and could have covered there on rule of law as well, and values-oriented foreign policy, which Rachel pointed out. But I wanted to ask you, the next major visit that will be on everyone's agenda is for Scholz to meet President Biden at some point soon. What do you think the three issues should be on that agenda if you were to advise either administration?
Well, I'll start. Maybe I'll just name one of them. I mean, obviously, I think that the United States is going to use this opportunity to see if we can shift Germany's approach to China at all. Because if you look at the last 16 years, let's say like the last 4 or 5 years particularly, Merkel has had historically a more mercantilist approach to her foreign policy, especially when it comes to China. It was viewed very much through the lens of economics and business, and she was very reticent to pick a side, choose between the United States and China. And I think there was a chorus of people that perhaps were, in the Trump administration, in the Obama administration, that were perhaps pushing for that. But I do think the Biden administration has come to the realization that that is not an approach that is going to work for Germany or Europe more broadly for that matter. But I do think it's going to be really interesting to see how this administration pushes Germany to toe a tougher line on China, especially in terms of human rights abuses, how that plays out at an EU level. And so that's something that I know that I'll be watching pretty closely, and many other people will be watching closely as well.
Thank you, Rachel. China, of course. Maybe over to Constanze.
I think it would be helpful for the Biden administration and the Germans to talk about how, repairing the effectiveness and legitimacy of governance, of domestic governance, is a precondition for any of us having effective and legitimate foreign and security policy, right? I mean, there are challenges to democracy everywhere. I don't need to lay this out in grim detail. But I think it would sort of introduce a sort of new note of humility and mutual empathy if our conversations expanded to include these issues, right? We're in this boat together, and the story, and the waters are pretty choppy.
Thank you, Tyson.
Well, I'm positive that Scholz will be bringing the climate issue to the table. That has moved up every call sheet in the German government in this new government. So if it was 5th or 6th in previous governments, or even 3rd or 4th, it's going to be 1 or 2 in the current government. And Germany has an ambitious agenda, phasing out coal by 2030, making 80% renewables, and they're going to be looking for partnership in that in many areas. Also, how is sustainability going to be part of foreign and security policy, development aid, tech transfer, which also has links to a lot of security questions, because a lot of it is linked to, again, getting back to technology, a lot of things that can be used for malevolent purposes in authoritarian states. Last thing I would mention on this front, which is a little bit worrying to me, the coalition negotiation did not mention the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. That was a conscious decision. And from what I've heard from here in Berlin, there are still open questions as to whether or not it should get Germany's backing. So I think it would be incumbent on both Brussels and Washington to say that this is a good faith effort to bring these two economies together on those issues that Annalena Baerbock mentioned, the issues of technology and economy, because this is the future of this relationship.
Thank you so much. And on that note, the future of this relationship, let me thank our panelists for this engaging and fun conversation. Tyson, Constanze, Rachel, thank you for joining us again. I hope we can return to this maybe after the first 100 days, and then we can hopefully speculate less and have some real meat to work with on this. But thank you, all of you, again. Thanks to the team.
Thank you.
And thank you to our viewers for joining us for this wrap up of the Germany Votes series. We'll continue to follow, obviously, this German government, US-German relations, and Germany's role in the world, and hope to have you with us when we next convene to discuss. Thank you so much from the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council.